Welcome to Bible in the News. Let me ask you a question. Is this the last generation? Those of us that believe in the Bible and believe that there is coming a time prophetically when it's all over, when God comes to a place where He says, this is it, the judgment is going to fall, and He sends Jesus, His Son, to bring the church home. And is this it? Well, you would think that, especially in my reading this week with Dennis Prager from Prager University, great social, cultural commentator. And he just went through an outline of where we're at in the slippery slope part. The slippery slope that many of us believe started sometime in the 1960s with the free love movement and the Summer of Love and 1968 and 1969 and Woodstock and all of those things that were taking place. And that period of time then led us to where we're at today. And where we're at today, according to Dennis Prager and according to the news, if you read the news, listen to the news, we're having 3- and 4-year-old children decide their own gender. We're having people send their children to vegan school so they can learn the plants have feelings too. And we're allowing young men to identify as young women and go into young women's locker rooms and compete on women's sports. And wow, this is a crazy time. And some of us, I think, would say, wow, can this get any worse? And is this the last generation? But I think, as I was watching today our children's program and dedicating a little baby of our children's pastor, Malachi Jonathan Reno, what are those children going to face? And here's my thought, that these children on that stage today are going to be growing up, if God doesn't bring a revival, they're going to be growing up in a society where biology doesn't matter. They're going to be growing up in a society that the boundaries, there are no boundaries. There are no fences. And they're going to be growing up in a very scary, scary society. That's my grandchildren. That's some of your children. And 20 years from now, that's what they're going to be growing up in. Now, I got a question for you. As a pastor, as a church, are we going to be ready to minister to the fallout of what's happening 20 years from now from this end of the slippery slope? If this is not the last generation, and this is not the generation that Jesus chooses to come back, we're going to have to deal with this. We're going to have to minister to this. We're going to have to reach out in love and compassion and grace and mercy. And you know what? I have confidence. And I'll tell you why I have confidence. And that is because I was 13 and 14 years old in 1968 and 69. And because my dad was a prophecy preacher, we were always watching the news. Anywhere we went, he was preaching about what was happening. He even loaded up the family station wagon and took all of us kids to Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and drove through and saw all the psychedelic drawings and so forth. But you know what? An amazing thing happened during that time, and that is people like Keith Green and came out of that generation of that sexual freedom and raised up to speak to their generation and changed not only the culture of that generation. In fact, it's one of the greatest revivals in the history of the world, and in my opinion. And and changed even the evangelical worship of today. It comes from that era, because God moved incredibly. Just last year I read Keith Green's No Compromise, written by Melody after Keith Green had died. And I listened to his messages and see his messages and think, wow, where is he today? And preaching that way. And then I recall the youth pastors that were in my life, a generation of young men that were raised up, like in my life was Vernon Fink, who eventually became a missionary to southern Utah and then to Africa and has since retired, who spoke into my life. And then I remember the youth pastors that I worked with as a district youth director for 14 years in the Rocky Mountain District. Incredible youth pastors anointed by God who made incredible impacts in their community and in their schools. And I remember walking with them some in their schools and seeing the incredible impact that they were happening because God raised them up. And then I was there long enough to see the youth pastors that came after them, that they mentored. And today I have the privilege of working alongside some pastors that were young men at those times in our youth camps and in those youth groups that are raised up now and are denominational leaders and changing the culture. You know what? I think this is probably the last generation. But if it is not, I believe that Acts chapter 2, beginning with verse number 16 and go through verse 19, and it tells us that in the last days, in the last generation, God will raise up young men and young women that will see visions and speak prophetically. You see, there is a Keith Green for the next generation. There is a David Wilkerson for the next generation. There is a Dawson McAllister for the next generation. There is men and women that will be anointed of God, young men and young women. And now I'm an older guy, okay? But I have a dream. And that dream is that this next generation can and will see the power of God because God's going to raise them up. And as a pastor, I have a passion to see those children and youth and young adults raised up to minister to this generation that I can't even comprehend what we're going to be facing 20 years from now. Now listen, as a church, we can fight it and we do need to stand with truth. And I'm one that will stand with truth and is standing with truth. But I pray God show us how to give the grace to this generation that 20 years from now, when the fallout, just like it happened with the sexual revolution, 20 years from then, that 20 years from now, that God will give us and show us how to exercise grace and truth to that next generation, because we're going to see them. They're going to be coming to us for answers, and God, let us hold on to the truth and show the grace to another generation. God, I pray that you will pour out your Spirit on young men and young women now, just like you did at the day of Pentecost, just like you did in 1968, just like I saw on young men and young women through the 80s and through most of the 90s, and saw on young men and young women who were youth pastors for me and ministered to my children and ministered to the children and youth in the churches that I have pastored. And I thank God for them, and I believe God is going to raise them up. We have to pray for them, believe in them, and ask God to pour out His Spirit again. Well, there's the sermon. Thank you for letting me be so passionate about that. God bless you. Have a great week.